Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
I'm Lisa, and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 2, episode 10, and this is the first episode of our brand new series on cannibals. So, I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I am a big fan of the show Supernatural. And one of the things I've always loved about that show is how the demons refer to the humans, specifically when they're possessing them so that they can come down to earth and do what they need to do. Down here, they call them meat suits. And I always thought that was so appropriate in a very strange way. And it's kind of appropriate to our topic today because when we talk about cannibalism, and I think one of the things that makes it really kind of gross and icky and just a general taboo is that it reduces humanity from a thinking, feeling, creative, productive society that's capable of civilization and great things to just essentially meat. And that's offensive to a lot of people. And so what I thought we could do for this particular episode is start out talking about the history of cannibalism, both in fiction and in actual history from an archaeological perspective. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Matt and Mel, on why this is such a taboo topic and why it is so scary to us. What is it about cannibalism that is so horrific and makes it fodder for really good horror literature and films? So first I thought we'd start out with the history. Now, Mel, I know you did a little bit of research on this.
Yeah, Lisa, I think I could talk a little bit about this. I know one of the articles that you shared with us when we were reading for this particular episode, I thought was really interesting because it really showed that there are a lot of debates among anthropologists and archaeologists about cannibalism, how it works, whether people have actually done it, why, when they did do it, were they doing it. And in one of the articles that you sent us, which was from, I believe, the 90s, it was in the New York Times, the science section, they were talking about how human bones in a 6,000-year-old cave dwelling in France appeared to have been butchered in the same manner as animal remains have been butchered, apparently for food. And so scientists and anthropologists were talking about how this must be Stone Age cannibalism. And so there was a debate about this because people were like, well, why aren't we finding more evidence? What could be the reason for this if it's an isolated event? There's arguments amongst scholars as to, whether the Aztecs were eating their human sacrifices, if so, which parts and why. And so it's really interesting to me how these kind of religious or spiritual aspects come into play with why people might be practicing cannibalism or ritual cannibalism. And also that age-old problem that we have in anthropology when we talk about anything, which is when anthropologists from one culture are looking at cultures that maybe have changed a lot. So they're looking at cultures in history, or they're looking at cultures that are developing at the same time, but they might see as inferior for whatever reason. They kind of identify them as others or think of them as they're different from us. And so cannibalism is one of those things that I feel like we kind of attribute to people. It's like, well, I don't do that. I wouldn't do that. My culture wouldn't do that. And so there's kind of this debate, even among scientists and anthropologists, as to what the deal is and what the interpretations are. But it seems like from that article that cannibalism seems to come from possible ritual religious reasons, or what they call in the article chronic nutritional stress, which is basically you're starving and you're going to die. And so you start using dead people as a source of meat, or at the extreme, you start killing people in order to eat them. And so it's almost like this, dare I use the term like a self-apocalyptic moment where your town, your area, your region is experiencing intense change and loss of food supply for whatever reason, whether it's war or a natural disaster, or you were moving to another place and you got stuck on the way, and then you end up eating other people. But it also, like, cannibalism is, as you said earlier, Lisa, just such a taboo thing that it's really difficult, I think, for us to look at it straight on, because we really just kind of shy away from it and don't even want to think about it or talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's the problem that these as you said, these archaeologists are coming up against, is it's hard to separate our own idea of something that is so taboo and something that is never done. And when it is done, it's considered a criminal act, to looking at it as, well, this could be part of a ritual or even part of a religion, which, I find really interesting. And this is getting away from the history just a little bit. But if you just look at like the language that we have and maybe like a linguistic type history, we will use cannibalistic language in a lot of ways. Yet the act itself is, as you said, so unimaginable that we don't even let our brains go there. I'm thinking of, in particular, this is what I thought of, Mel, when you were talking about other cultures and maybe a religious practice, and how cannibalism could be a religious practice. And then you look at something like Christianity, and it talks about eating of the body of Christ, which I don't think anybody would consider. I don't know, maybe depending on where you fall on that, but it's not considered like a criminal cannibalistic act, but we have that language. Or even kind of taking the religion out of it, when you see a baby with those cute little fat cheeks, and what's the first thing you say? Oh, I could eat you up. So we have this language of consuming other people and that being a good thing. Yet the act itself, it doesn't cross the lines from language to physical. We do put up that wall almost immediately when somebody starts talking about it. And you're right in saying that there do seem to be two major camps when you're looking at the historical precedent of cannibalism. And the first one is, as you said, some sort of ritual, which I don't think we fully understand, and I don't think we will fully understand unless we can be part of the culture that we're studying, because of the taboo aspect of it. But then there's also the survival aspect of it. And of course, there's the famous Donner Party. Other examples include like Jamestown, oh man, going back into history, almost any time that there was either war and or the settlement of a new land, it seems like that there were instances of this, small pockets of where people would encounter a harsh environment that they weren't prepared for. And when faced with that, coupled with probably illness and then a lack of food and water, that seems to be what you turn to. Although, curiously, in all of these stories, people are very, and this may be the taboo aspect of it too, but people are very careful to say, we exhausted every other option. In other words, this wasn't the first thing we turned to. It wasn't the second thing. It wasn't the third thing. We had tried everything else and failed, which I find really interesting when we do have surviving, I guess, testimony of these times, which we have a little bit with the Donner Party.
Oh, I was going to say that the Donner Party is such an interesting, horrifying example, because, in a couple of the accounts that I read, it was like they basically kind of became like a legend. There was so much just interest in their story before the last person had even been rescued, because I think it took like 4 months to rescue them all. Well, they weren't all rescued, but to rescue the ones that could be. And a lot of the speculation about it was not necessarily about the fact that they had been misled with that, oh, this is this amazing Hastings cutoff, which will get you to the west a lot faster. So they started on the Oregon Trail, as we all know, I'm sure, of our generation from the video game. And then at one of the forks, this guy named Hastings had told people, well, if you just keep going, like go a little to the south and go over through Utah and Nevada, you'll get there faster. Well, actually, it added more miles and more time and slowed them down so much because they had to break their own trail and kept breaking their equipment and hurting their animals on it, that by the time they got to the desert portions and the mountain portions, it was winter and they couldn't make it any further. And so you have them, starting out late, you have them taking it the wrong way. You have them going through all this privation, and they're wasting away in some ways by all the activity that they have to do. And then the illness. It's just a horrifying situation. But like even right afterward in the time period in the 1840s, people are speculating like, oh, well, did cannibalism take place? And if so, did they kill people? And just like you were saying, Lisa, like a lot of people who gave their accounts afterward, they would change slightly. They were worried, understandably, about meeting people who had been on the party afterward and knowing that maybe they had partaken of one of their family members. And then, of course, there was one of the final people to be rescued who we still don't know with 100% certainty to this day if he murdered the Donner parents and for food, or if he did wait until they died. Who knows? Nobody was there. But he was just vilified and pursued and tormented in his life because people just kind of jumped to that conclusion. And yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting that there was such I don't know what the word is, but interest in this taboo thing. Even then, it's like now you say the Donner Party and we all know, everybody knows, but even then everybody was talking about it. The Donner Party, the place where they were rescued from, was one of the first instances in our history of dark tourism, where people would travel from all over the country to look at the cabins where they were in when they were rescued. And like this aura of horror and mystery, but we still want to talk about it, is so interesting, I think. And I think it's going to keep being that way. It just kind of grabbed the national imagination.
Well, I think in talking about this thing as a taboo, you sort of talked about it a little already, but I wanted to kind of flesh the point out a little bit. Flesh, no pun intended.
Nice one.
the idea of, in order to actually be a cannibal, another human has to die. And with the Donner Party, there was that question of whether or not some of the people died of natural causes or were they murdered. And I think that's a big part of it. We have, pretty much every major religion in the world has a prohibition against killing. And I'd say that that's probably a pretty good thing. And so you've got that. But even taking out the religious aspect, you still have, in order to be a cannibal, you're eating another human being who has died. And so what I wanted to kind of raise along with this idea of the Donner Party is there's a guy, and I'm going to butcher this name because I do not speak German, but his name was, you may remember him from about 15 years ago. His name was Armin Maives, but he was a German guy who had a voluntary victim for cannibalism. Like, he had posted online about wanting to have a person, volunteer to be eaten, and he finally found somebody, and he did. He let him kill him and eat him, and there's a whole other backstory to it. But this Maivis guy was originally charged with manslaughter and convicted, and then actually was retried and found guilty of murder. So even with someone who was videotaped voluntarily agreeing to be killed and eaten, even that is too much for us. And this was in, I believe, 2005. So 13 years ago. We're not talking a couple hundred years ago. We're talking 21st century. It's still too much for us as humans to even understand. Why would someone want to eat someone? Why would somebody volunteer to be killed and eaten? The guy who was eaten was not, I don't believe he had a terminal illness or anything like that. So, I mean, in order to be a cannibal, somebody's got to get eaten. And that's a really hard thing to get around.
Yeah, well, and it does bring up the idea of, what other taboos are also happening in conjunction with it. Because we want to think that if faced with starvation, and that's your only option, and you're not actually killing anybody, then okay, maybe we can say it's acceptable. And that was one of the things, Mel, as you pointed out, that was so problematic with the Donner Party, is people wanted to know, well, wait, when did you eat them? Were they dead yet? Did you murder them? What happened? And there were books that were written, I mean, we're talking 20, 30 years after the fact. So there were still surviving members of that group, and who finally publicly commented and said, well, we waited until people were dead. We did cook human flesh and we fed it to the youngest children, I guess with the idea of they were going to die first if we did not get them nourishment. So we fed it to them first. So if it's an idea of pure survival, then yeah, there may be a morbid curiosity to it, but it's something that's forgivable. But then when you bring up, Matt, as you did, somebody who actually puts out an ad and says, may I kill you and eat you? Well, just because you ask somebody's permission first and they consent, murder isn't one of those things that you can write off legally if you say, well, I got their consent first. There are all sorts of, because then you get into assisted suicide territory, and, that's still a huge taboo, and that is still very much illegal in a lot of places. And so when you start like kind of crossing those lines, it's the same thing. The man who was named the cannibal cop, and I can't think of his name now, his real name, but he was the one who was a cop, and he was found with a bunch of websites and searches on his computer. Basically, people thought he was going to find somebody to kill and eat. That was like his fetish. And that's the way he explained it is, well, this is just a fetish that I have, and it's nothing I would actually do. And so, then you got into the idea of thought crimes. But I think because cannibalism is so closely connected to murder, that it's hard for us to separate it out.
Well, I think also there's the horror of, like, if it's a starvation thing, you might be eating your friends and family members, right? And that's an extra horror to it. Because, and that was another thing with the Donner Party is, like, you had kids possibly eating part of a parent or something. And, it's terrible when you think about it to have to make the decision. But then, yeah, that's an extra kind of thing where it's like, you don't want to be eating your mom, like that's just... That's a terrible thing.
I hate to make light of it because it is a horrible, horrible thing. But then you have to question, does that make my morality something that's conditional? Because is it okay if I don't know the person? What if I'm starving and I happen to cross somebody and I watch them have a heart attack in front of me and I have no idea who they are? I mean, is that not as bad as if you watch, like you said, a friend or a parent or something, somebody die and you think, well, I loved you, but I'm starving. It really brings up an interesting, because when you look at it from at least a literature perspective, for instance, when you have examples of cannibalism, and this is going way back, like to the ancient Greeks even, cannibalism was a form of revenge. If you think about the myth of Tantalus, for instance. Do you guys remember Tantalus?
Not in the slightest.
I had to look him up. I did not remember him from my Edith Hamilton studies in high school. So
well, I actually, when we were preparing for this, because as I was trying to think of examples of, I immediately thought of Shakespeare, of Titus Andronicus, because in the end of that, to get revenge for his daughter's rape and mutilation, Titus cooks up her attackers and feeds them to their mother. It's a horrific scene in the end. Well, that whole play is horrific, but that seems particularly cruel given everything that's been happening. And he doesn't let up with that play. And I thought, there's got to be things in Greek mythology. This sound, cannibalism seems like it would go right alongside incest and everything else, that all the other taboos that they explode in those. And so I called a friend of mine who actually teaches ancient Greek and Roman mythology. And she was like, oh, yeah, it's all in there. And then she's like, well, do you remember Tantalus? And I was like, I didn't. And she said, well, that's where we get the word tantalize. which I thought was really interesting because here we have essentially a cannibal story, and that's where we get the word tantalize.
Which is really disturbing.
Which is so disturbing. But so he apparently was favored among the gods, and he was welcomed to join the gods up on Mount Olympus and sit at their table. I think he was one of these who was the son of Zeus, and his mother was somebody, not a god, like a lot of Zeus's children. But he stole the ambrosia from the god's table, which he was not supposed to do, and was taking it back to people, basically, because he wanted to make them understand the divine secrets of the gods. So it's this idea of kind of forbidden knowledge that he's taken back. And later, for some reason that I don't understand, he sacrifices his son to the gods, cuts him up into pieces, and serves him to the gods. And then the gods realize what is happening and are very upset with him because they've eaten something that was essentially, I guess, part god. And so he is banished from Mount Olympus. And when he dies, he's punished for eternity. And it is one of these that's he's made to stand where he's under a fruit tree. And this is where you understand the tantalize. But because his crimes, I guess, were food related, he was punished and he couldn't reach the fruit on the tree. So he was forever hungry, but it was just out of his reach. And then there was a pool of water that would shrink every time he got near it. So he was always thirsty. So kind of this, horrible, never being able to be satisfied. And that was his torture for eternity, I guess, for his crimes. But that goes along, I think, this idea of killing somebody for revenge and feeding it to somebody else, where we get from the ancient Greeks, we get from Shakespeare. And that may play into the idea of the taboo of it too. Because if you're just doing it because you're going to starve to death, we can forgive that. But to cut somebody up, to kill them, and to feed them to somebody else unknowingly out of some sort of revenge, that seems to be the worst of the worst. And so those are the kind of two, I think, extremes that we get in this idea of cannibalism.
Well, and he's also giving them his son to eat too, which, has that family aspect in as well.
Right. Yeah.
Which, thank goodness the gods brought his son back to life after all that.
They did.
That's
they did. They couldn't get back. I think if I remember the story, now this is all sort of coming back. But if I remember,
it was
right,
part of his shoulder.
Right.
Yeah.
They never got back that part of the shoulder because somebody had already digested it or something gross.
I looked it up today. Demeter had eaten his shoulder. She was so distraught about the abduction of her daughter by Hades that she didn't realize she was eating people food. And so they were like, well, we can't get this back. So they just made him a new shoulder out of ivory just to help him out.
The shoulder of ivory. Yeah, now I'm remembering this.
Though, it's pretty interesting because it's revenge, but it could also be human sacrifice for ritual religious purpose because he is sacrificing his son to the gods, so to speak. It almost seems like both are working together there in some really weird way.
Well, I mean, you bring up the idea of revenge and it, not to draw too fine a comparison between Shakespeare and Trey Parker and Matt Stone, but there is an episode of South Park where for revenge, Cartman makes a character, he kills the character's parents and makes him eat them unknowingly as pure revenge. And I just kind of wanted to throw that in because it's one of the most horrifying things I've seen in a long time because you keep thinking that it's going to be a joke, but no, he really did kill the guy's parents and cook them into chili.
Which is basically like the plot of a, Sweeney Todd. There are several other examples that are flying right out of my head at the moment. What was the one where the girl, it had Kathy Bates in it, and she had killed, it was one of those dual storylines, and she had killed not Kathy Bates, another character had killed a man. And then there were hints that she was serving him up in her barbecue.
Wait, fried green tomatoes?
Fried green tomatoes. Why was that so difficult for me to come up with? But yeah, I mean, you take like a, Sweeney Todd, either the original Penny Dreadful story or the musical, or even something like Fried Green Tomatoes, and there is that idea of there's an added horror, not just that somebody would do that out of revenge, would kill out of revenge, but that they are unknowingly serving it up to the general public. And that is one of the taboos and horrors that we really haven't touched on, but the idea of accidentally eating human flesh.
Well, that's the plot of Soylent Green, isn't it? I mean, spoiler alert, because but again, movie's
hey guys,
like 60 years
people.
old. But yeah, like that's kind of the big reveal at the end of Soylent Green, is that Soylent Green is people, and that's the horrifying realization that Charlton Heston comes to, right? So that everyone had been unknowingly eating people, and same with, like you said, Sweeney Todd. I mean, there is that element of revenge, but he's serving them up in meat pies that just anybody can eat. And that's, I mean, that's not cool.
Yeah, I mean, if you're getting your revenge on a certain person, that's fine, but feeding it to everyone, no.
Okay, well, yes, that may have been what I said, but that's not quite what I meant. I am not endorsing cannibalism here, just for the record.
But it does hit a different type of terror within you, because it would be one thing if you sat down for a meal and after you finished, somebody said, by the way, that's your sister. There would be a certain horror to that. But then just to find out that, hey, like this restaurant I go to all the time, or maybe even to kind of put it in something we would understand, like if we found out a place like McDonald's or something was doing that. And it's a place that's so widespread and, so accessible to, Matt, as you said, it's like a meat pie. It's so accessible to everyone. You don't have to have a lot of money to go buy this. And the fact that everybody is now participating in it, that is something else entirely, because it does take away the familial aspect of it, but it doesn't in any way make it okay. And I think when you look at it from that way, and a little bit of what like Soylent Green touched on, and even, I know this was irony and satire, but if you look at something like Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, the idea of, hey, we're having a financial crisis right now, and there are poor people out there who can't eat, and obviously they're having too many children, so why don't we just kill two birds with one stone and, give them some baby-friendly recipes, and they can cut down on the population at the same time that they are solving their starvation problem, which, of course, he meant a satire and to be so horrific that nobody would actually do it, and we need to stop thinking of people as chattel, basically. But that's the problem with something like that. That's the problem with something like a meat pie restaurant or even Soylent Green. It's the idea that people are completely stripped of their humanity, and they are no different than like cows or chickens or something that we see on a farm. Let's just load them up. Let's put them somewhere where we can hold them until we're ready to kill them. And then they become, what's the word I'm looking for? They become something to be consumed. Livestock. Thank you. My brain is not working tonight. I can't think of livestock or fried green tomatoes. I apologize for anything I say on this episode.
Well, I wonder if, too, that, this idea of, it's a dehumanization, right?
Yes.
What you're talking about is not viewing a person as a person, but as a food source, the same as a cow or a chicken or fish. And, not everywhere globally, but in America, we have a prohibition against eating certain animals as well. Like, we would be very horrified if somebody served us dog or cat as
Absolutely.
dinner. And I actually knew someone once who spent some time working in a meat market in a fairly rural area, and they would sell raccoon. And apparently, because raccoon is, when it is skinned, it looks very similar to dog. They have to leave one paw on, like unskinned, to show that it is not that you're not selling someone dog meat. And I mean, I wonder if there's some sort of connection there, because we attribute these human-like qualities onto our pets, at least in America. You know, we have this human-like emotional connection to dogs and cats more so than we would to a chicken or a cow. Although I would personally have a hard time killing a cow or chicken myself. So there's that as well. But yeah, I think that idea of that dehumanization of it and depersonalization aspect of it is certainly something that would make cannibalism pretty scary thing. Like I really don't like the idea of just eating people, and this whole episode I've been a little uncomfortable because of it. I don't know about you two, but yeah, it's not cool.
Yeah, I will say that this episode series, in preparing for it, the word I have used most is icky. There is just something so revolting, and that there's just that immediate, you want to put your hands up and be, no, thank you. That's nothing I want to deal with. But you're right. It is the dehumanization. And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about in the opening, with the idea of calling bodies meat suits or calling people meat suits, because that does the same thing effectively. It strips some of their humanity. It takes away their personality. It takes away, any familial ties they may have, any feelings or emotions they may have, any thoughts, anything that they may have created, or it takes away all of that and just reduces it to meat. And I think that's what makes us so uncomfortable with this idea of cannibalism, whether or not you're doing it out of survival, or you're doing it out of revenge, or maybe you're doing it out of some sort of ritual or religion, which I know we haven't kind of talked around that over the course of this episode. And I think, at least for me in part, I don't know that much about some of the other cultures that are tied to ritual cannibalism. And because from the little that I've read, the archaeologists can't even seem to agree on what was happening or if it was happening, that I just don't feel comfortable enough to say, oh yeah, this culture, they were doing this, they were doing that. But I will just say in general, when you're talking about a ritual cannibalism, it usually, from what we think happened or what we think we know, did not happen often. And it either took place after a battle, where if you killed somebody who was particularly strong and you admired them, you would eat a little bit of them with the idea of, now I will take on some of that strength. Or, and this is a complete reversal from everything we've been talking about, but the idea of, after a loved one has died, eating just a little bit. And again, this is very different from, I think, the way that it's portrayed in a lot of movies, which we will talk about in future episodes. But this idea of, oh, there is a tribe out there and they've never met a civilized person before. So what are they going to do when they see you? Well, they're going to kidnap you and eat you. Because they don't, that's what they do. And I think that, well, that's just disturbing on a whole other level. And I think
that's part of the fear, though, isn't it? That, like, I mean, yeah, a big part of the fear is the being killed and eaten thing, but that de-evolution, that loss of civilization. I mean, I couldn't help but think, in preparing for this episode, there was an episode of The Walking Dead a few seasons back where one of the characters gets captured by cannibals and they cut his leg off and eat it in front of him. And they're definitely shown as having devolved into this cannibalistic state to the point where that's what they enjoy, but they're no longer civilized. I mean, they're put as this contrast to to Rick and his group. And so, I mean, that's another part of this cannibalism thing to untangle, isn't it? I mean, that's what happens with the Donner Party. They would not have turned into cannibals if they hadn't been trapped in their circumstances. So, you know, they kind of devolved a little bit as well. Same with these, you know, pre-civilization tribes or whatever you want to call it. You know, I'm thinking of like Cannibal Holocaust or other movies like that. But that's what it is, right? I mean, that's another aspect, is this loss of civilization.
Well, and that's where it kind of crosses over with some of the things that we've talked about in the past, like post-apocalyptic narratives, or even when we did our series on the zombie, it encompasses all of that, because, you know, each one of those is a de-evolution, as you said, Matt, and an idea where civilization has broken down either in the person or in culture in general, but where now the only thing people are concerned about is food and where to get it. And I think that is scary for a lot of people, because we want to think that we are evolved and that we are on a higher plane and we would never do that. You know, we're better than that. And I think it's scary when you whether or not it's a cannibal tale or it's a post-apocalyptic narrative or it's a zombie story, we don't want to think that we can lose our grasp on civilization or even our humanity that quickly. We don't want to think it can be taken away from us that quickly. And I think that's one of the things that probably makes cannibalism a taboo, particularly in our culture, because we want to be civilized so badly.
Well, and it also becomes a way to label other people that we may not understand or value as much as our own culture, right? I mean, when the Europeans were fanning out across the world and meeting all these folks who, oh my God, they're not Christian, oh my gosh, they're not civilized like us, whether they were cannibals or not, they would call them cannibals. And there was this idea that, like, oh, Europeans are so humane and civilized and not like these people that we're encountering. And I think that's where the real sting of, say, Swift's A Modest Proposal comes from, is this idea of, like, you know, you think that you're above this, like you're all horrified by the satire I wrote because you don't understand irony, yet at the same time you're dehumanizing the poor and treating them horribly. And he lists, like, was it 10 things they could do to help the poor that no one's doing? And he's like, well, we might as well eat them. And they're just horrified. And I think there's this idea of, like, you push this off on other people, like, oh my God, these people are cannibals and they may be cannibals. They must be evil and horrible and they're going to eat me, but I'm okay here in France or England or whatever. But, you know, the French essayist Montaigne, he had an essay on cannibalism where he said, like, stop worrying about whether they're cannibals in other places in the world and stop torturing people, stop drawing and quartering them, stop treating them horribly in prison, stop, you know, killing people. And there's this idea of, like, well, that's what these other people do over here because they're not as great as us, so we can go take their stuff. I'll just put it blatantly. Yet at the same time, there's all these dehumanizing and horrible and inhumane things going on in their culture. It's just not eating people per se, but there's this knee-jerk reaction to that's the horror, that's the taboo, that's the terrible thing. I don't want to look at my own problems.
And especially when you think about, you know, for instance, like, what happened in America, you know, the idea of the Europeans coming over, and you read some of these accounts of how the people that they encountered were friendly, and it was easy. I'm using air quotes that you can't see right now. It was easy for the European settlers to come in and say, oh, they're savages, they're cannibals, let's kill them all. You know, that was the reason that they needed. And so it does kind of fit very well with this idea of the other. And it has an us versus them mentality built in kind of nicely. But one thing that I do want to bring up is this idea that some anthropologists think that our aversion to cannibalism isn't just from these stories or this idea, everything that we've talked about, this dehumanization and this fear of losing our civilized self, but that it comes from a very real, kind of a biological history lesson that we carry with us. Because in some places, the consumption of human flesh has actually led to a disease that turned out to be deadly. And Mel, I know you were talking a little bit about it. It has to do with a certain protein.
It does. If one eats particularly neurological material of a person, like the brain, and I believe this is a theory. They're not. I don't even think that now they're 100% sure how this works. But the theory is that there are these prion proteins that can be. I think the term was that they're folded, and I think it's like misfolded or non-folded prions can be in some people's neurological material, and if you eat that, then you can get this neurological disease. And I know in some of the articles I read, they called it like a spongiform encephalopathy. So it's kind of like a brain disease that you get directly from eating other people's brains, basically. And they were talking about this particular group that they studied. The women, I think, and the children were being infected with this more than the men because they were eating that neurological material while the men were maybe eating more muscle. But then there's also been the theory that some groups have formed kind of an immunity to it through their ritual participation. But yeah, and this happens with other animals as well. If you introduce meat or parts of an animal to that animal, like feed a cow, basically, like there can be neurological disease that results from that. And so it could be an interesting evolutionary thing that happened to keep us from eating each other, even though there is cannibalism in nature, there seems to be something there that keeps it from developing on a large scale.
Yeah, the whole idea of mad cow disease, right?
Right.
This idea that, yeah, perhaps at some point in our past, we realize, this is making us sick. This is not good for us. So we're going to tell stories to prevent other people from doing it, which is kind of that's another interesting way to look at how the entire taboo itself developed, because we can talk about how gross and icky it is and how, we really don't want to dwell on it too long. But I think that's a really interesting kind of scientific theory of why it is a taboo.
Well, I guess that's probably a good place for us to go ahead and stop for this episode so that we have plenty left over for the rest of our series. I did want to just, before we leave, take a moment to remind everybody to please, if you have a moment, rate and review us on iTunes, and check us out on social media. We're on Twitter at NoFearCast, and same with Instagram. We really appreciate everyone who's interacted with us, and we love hearing from people. You can email us at nofearcast@gmail.com. And if you're in a particularly giving mood, visit us on Patreon at patreon.com/nofearcast. And if you support us for $5 a month, you will unlock the special mini episodes that we release on the weeks when the main episodes don't come out. So that will be one episode per week of the No Fear Cast. But regardless, we thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.